In late 2005, a small team at the EMC2 lab in Santa Fe, New Mexico, set up a tabletop fusion experiment called WB-6. The device produced roughly 1 billion deuterium-deuterium fusion reactions per second at 12.5 kilovolts of drive voltage. This chart compares a standard Farnsworth-Hirsch fusor baseline to the reported WB-6 result. Robert Bussard presented this framing in his 2006 International Astronautical Congress paper. It shows the WB-6 output outperforming the baseline by roughly 100,000 times at comparable conditions. But we've got a critical data caveat here. That massive figure rests on a thin count of exactly 9 detected neutrons spread across 5 test runs. The confidence interval's wide. We're leaving the deep device mechanics aside here. If you want a breakdown of the beta-1 threshold or the wiffle ball geometry, we cover that in our separate physics video. Even with the thin neutron count, the data indicated WB-6 hit a confinement regime no comparable cusp device had ever reached before. Then the result went quiet. A year later, in November 2006, Bussard gave a Google Tech Talk to a public audience. Near the end of his presentation, he told the room his contract monitor on the Defense Nuclear Agency and DARPA side had placed parts of the post-WB-6 work under a publication embargo. He gave the restriction window as 11 years. The public flow of information stopped. This was a direct institutional command keeping the data out of the open scientific literature. To understand how a contract monitor gets that kind of leverage, we've got to look back to the late 1980s. The Department of Energy initially declined Bussard's proposal for the Polywell concept. DARPA and the Defense Nuclear Agency picked up the funding line around 1988, moving the work from civilian energy oversight into military research channels. Jim Anson, an astrophysicist, managed the early program as the technical director on the Strategic Defense Office side. That military money carried the engineering team through the WB-1 to WB-5 builds. By the time WB-6 ran in 2005, the federal pipeline had heavily thinned out. That makes Bussard's 2006 Google Talk a desperate fundraising pitch. He hoped Silicon Valley might write a check to replace the stalled federal funds. The embargo blanketed a program that had already been financially starved for years. The two forces worked in tandem to suffocate the technology. On October 6, 2007, Robert Bussard died of multiple myeloma at the age of 79. 2 years later, the Navy issued a follow-on contract to EMC2. The contract numbers N68936, 09C0125, carrying roughly $12 million for WB7 and WB8. A crucial structural shift happened here. The engineering team tested the next geometries with Navy money, but the person who argued against tokamak orthodoxy for 2 decades was no longer in the room to defend his methodology. EMC2's public commentary suggests the WB7 and WB8 data came back ambiguous. Neither device clearly advanced toward net energy gain. The WB8 final report absolutely exists today. It sits under a limited distribution restriction. We won't guess what the pages contain because nobody outside the contract monitor circle is allowed to read it. When a elite scientist dies, the debate shifts to the bureaucracy. The critics are forced to argue against an absence of information, while the contract monitor holds the restricted data. This timeline tracks the open literature from 2006 to 2017. The span between 2009 and 2015 remains completely empty. EMC2 published nothing on the WB program. The first surface break arrives in 2015. Park and colleagues published a paper in Physical Review X right before the 11-year embargo Bussard described would expire in 2017. That 2015 paper validated the cusp confinement physics directly in line with Bussard's early predictions. We lack a corroborating document from the Department of Defense to explicitly confirm Bussard's 11-year restriction, but the behavioral record speaks for itself. The timeline behaves exactly like a gag order in practice. After direct Navy funding for the hardware line stopped, EMC2 pivoted. They moved away from physical builds and began running high-performance computing simulations of the concept. By the mid-2020s, the company was back on the conference circuit, resuming publications and partnering with major institutions like Los Alamos National Laboratory. This exposes the administrative tools used to bury the WB-6 result. It took a publication restriction clause in the contract, a final report stamped with limited distribution, and a follow-on funding decision that quietly failed to refresh.